Hello, everybody. I've got Gene Nelson here. He's got the subset Green Nuke that is really good, and he's been almost tilting at windmills sometime on trying to get California to see common sense for their energy. But there's been forward progress. So let's start off with Gene. Why does California need dispatchable nuclear power?
Well, we need a form of power to run this entire state. This is the most populous state in the country. We need safe, abundant, 24/7 reliable. And of course, power needs don't disappear when the sun goes down. That's why we need it 24/7 reliable. It needs to be cost effective because California, unfortunately, is burdened with the most expensive power in the continental U.S.
Now, why are they burdened with the most expensive?
Well, we'll kind of get into that in a little minute here.
Okay.
But let's just leave it for now that they are burdened. And the other thing is, if we're going to be an environmental leader, we also need it to be pollution free. And that means both free of air pollution and water pollution. And nuclear checks all those boxes. And that's super, super important. And dispatchable means it's under human control because we need the power when we need it. You can't just say, well, gee, the sun isn't up, so we're not going to do this operation, or the sun isn't up, we're not going to land this aircraft, or whatever. So that's why you need dispatchable 24/7 reliable power. And if we go back in history a bit, we find out that coal fired power has been a really big part of that, even in places like Colorado, which has abundant coal deposits. So coal is a good form of energy. It's a great way to, you basically need it to make steel, things like that. But it comes at a cost. And that cost is that it creates both a large amount of air pollution and it produces water pollution from the coal ash. When the rain falls on the coal ash, it leaches things into the ground, and that includes arsenic. Coal has some really big environmental disadvantages. You, of course, remember the concept of acid rain.
Yeah.
It's been a big problem in the Northeast, but it's even a problem in Colorado. So we don't want those things in the environment. And for those reasons, coal isn't good.
Well, and I would add, you all got all the stuff around mining coal too, which
Yeah.
in West Virginia they just take down a whole mountaintop.
That's right. Well, that's become the dominant way to produce coal is you just remove what's called the overburden and the heck with it. And of course, it's really difficult to properly remediate that without adding more water pollution. So getting back to nuclear power, the thing that we need next is we have a whole network of generators, and those generators need to be synchronized. Kind of like, think about when you push your child on a swing, you have a very precise time that you're going to push the child to make the swing go higher. Well, the same kind of synchrony is true at a much faster scale when we're dealing with a power grid. Namely, if all the generators are operating in unison, they cooperate. If one gets out of sync, it actually can get burned out by the power from the other generators.
Well, it actually can shake itself to death. Like if you have a gas turbine and it comes in out of sync.
Yeah.
Because it has the power grid feeding it going, oh, I see a motor.
Yeah.
And you can actually have one of those things shake itself to death and collapse to whatever foundation it has.
Yes, that's a very expensive outcome of not being properly synchronized. And great amount of technology is applied to that. Typically, there's a satellite feed to make sure that everything is synchronous down to the millionth of a second. So it's a super, super important thing. And it turns out that, get back to nuclear, there it is. It's the big dog in California. Our Diablo Canyon power plant is the biggest generator and the biggest contributor to synchronous grid inertia to keep the lights on.
Well, the other thing that's interesting, correct me if I'm wrong, the second biggest things that are keeping that inertia in there and in sync are the coal plants.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem because those coal plants are connected to California's grid by a long distance extension cord, about 1,000 miles long. And so if that cord gets broken, the the ability of those coal plants to synchronize the California power grid, particularly in Southern California, goes away. That heartbeat used to be supplied by San Onofre Nuclear Generating Station, and while the plant could have been repaired easily, the owners chose to not repair it, instead stick to ratepayers for billions of dollars. It was a very unfortunate situation. That's really what CGNP cut its teeth on, was trying to keep San Onofre open, but we got blocked by Southern California Edison from doing that. They're the dominant owner of the songs.
So why'd they shut it down? Was that pressure from environmentalists or the politicians, or was it just the accountants?
Mostly those coal interests, because they were already supplying the power whenever that plant was offline. Because you have to periodically refuel a nuclear power plant. So more than likely, they already had a contractual arrangement when the owners said, when they called up at the end of January of 2012, said, hey, we got a problem here. We got some really tiny leaks in our secondary loop. The owners of that coal-fired power plant said, sure, we'll be happy to fill in, because it was just business for them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's clearly a problem.
Are those coal plants in-state or are they out-of-state?
We're talking about all out of state. There's a tiny little coal plant, but California has really made itself look like it's an environmental hero, but all it's done is to move the coal out of state. So, for example, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power owns or operates a huge coal-fired power plant named Intermountain near Delta, Utah. And then they have a DC power line that's dedicated just to move that power from Utah to Los Angeles and a few other suburbs. And it's just environmental hypocrisy, because the plant is still polluting, it's still killing people around it, but it's just Delta, Utah. And then they applaud themselves and say, look how clean we are. Well, it's just hypocrisy. And to get it worse, they even came up with a California-specific legal euphemism called unspecified power. Sounds a lot better than coal-fired power, doesn't it? But that's what it is. Unspecified power is mostly coal-fired power, and they even get, if you go to the California Independent System Operator website, you find out they get a preferential treatment on the pollution created by those power plants. They're credited as if they were a modern combined cycle power plant, which is the cleanest form of fossil-fired power. It's a real crooked deal as far as I'm concerned, and it should be corrected. But we have, I know we've got just a little bit more time here, and I just want to talk about the problems with solar and wind and batteries. Those are all what are called inverter-based resources, which means they don't contribute significant amounts of synchronous grid inertia. So if you hook, for example, a big load like the huge pumps that move the water from the Central Valley over the Tehachapi Mountains into Los Angeles. Those, if we just hooked up a solar generator to those, it would heat up the motors, but that's about it. It doesn't have the muscle to move that water over the mountains.
Is that just because there's not enough solar, or is it because it's not in sync?
There's an abundance of solar. It has to do with something called power factor. You don't get, and I have to start talking about vectors and stuff like that, and I really don't want to on this talk. So I like to just use the idea it's got to have muscle, and you don't have muscle with solar or wind or batteries. You need a large synchronous generator, and that's, of course, the big dog. Diablo Canyon is the number one in California, but we can also get it from coal out of state or from gas in state. But so here's our problems with solar. On top of that, they're very expensive. Of course, they hide it they use the same probably accounting companies that Enron did to hide stuff off the books. So while they are very expensive, and I know this for myself because I'm an amateur radio operator, and I purchased the components for powering my transceiver. So one of my power sources is solar power, but it's very, very expensive.
Well, and they just shut down that one. God, where is it? I think it's sort of out by Barstow, where it's all the mirrors reflecting onto the solar generator.
Yeah, that was on Interstate 15, I think it is, between Los Angeles. And not a surprise, because it was a disaster from the beginning. So that feeds into the 3 C's, which are capital cost, curtailment, and complexity. Complexity is those concentrated solar plants were a perfect example of that. You had big mirrors, and they had to move the sun just to just the right spot to heat up a. Anyway, it's complicated and silly. But hey, people made a lot of money off of it, so that's why they did it. And then there's this curtailment problem, which is the sun shines when it wants to shine, not when we need it to shine. So we actually have to curtail the huge amount of solar power that is present when we don't need it. And this is just, in economist terms, it's a total sunk cost. We just pay for it and we receive no economic benefit. So that's inefficient, and that's clearly a problem with curtailment.
What if you had a moderate amount of solar so that it was the amount you needed while the sun was up for peak usage? I mean, you got the duck curve, it's not going to handle peak, but handle a little of it.
It really turns out that the most efficient, most reliable grids have no solar on them at all. But the thing is, it's been pounded into our head by persistent propaganda that solar is somehow good for the grid. It's not.
Well, what would you use for peak then? In a perfect world, would that be nuclear too?
Well, it will eventually have the kind of reactors that allow us to respond to peak needs. In the interim, let's use something that we have abundant and reliable sources of, and that's using peakers, which is natural gas. So it's nuclear plus gas really makes for a very reliable grid. Solar and wind, Warren Buffett, I think, was really candid in 2014 in an interview with U.S. News and World Report when he said, well, the only reason I have those wind generators is for the tax credits, which is, they're funded by you and I, the taxpayer, the little guys. And so it's kind of a reverse Robin Hood thing. And it shouldn't be there, but Warren can also hire the best lobbyists in the industry. Well, so he gets lots of money. Anyway, so just kind of to recap here, we need dispatchable nuclear power. Diablo Canyon is working right now. The plant's designed to last a century. Let's keep it running. Coal isn't the way to go simply because it's so darn dirty. And we need synchronous grid inertia to keep everything all running in sync. And again, Diablo Canyon is the biggest contributor of that. We want to avoid solar, wind, and batteries because of capital cost curtailment and complexity. And of course, there was this recent fire at the Moss Landing, the biggest battery fire in history. Just an example, and it's an issue here in San Luis Obispo County because the same company, Vistra, wants to put in an even bigger plant at the site of a former gas plant in Morro Bay, and we're strongly opposed to that as well. So we have Californians for Green Nuclear Power. I helped found it in 2013, and it's still plugging away. Warren Buffett's tried to shut it down, but so far without success. And we have a Substack, which you referenced at the beginning of the broadcast, which is called Green Nuke, kind of a shortening of Californians for Green Nuclear Power. And it's got a lot of really informative, easy-to-read articles about various aspects of power policy. And thank you for having me here on the air.
Yeah, and I want to add for everybody on here, go hit Green Nuke, especially if you live in California, because I'm just going to leave it this. It's interesting, and you will find it worth your time. So, Gene, thank you, and thank everybody who's watching.
Thank you for endorsing the work that we've been doing, and look forward to talking more in the future, Dave.